so I wanted to thank Qualitative360 for inviting me here today. And so you might say, why is a medical device guy standing in front of a bunch of amazing qualitative researchers, the people who are at the cutting edge of what they're doing? So two things. One is about you, because you are the most important thing. It's an invitation. What I'm doing in China is not being done effectively by your industry. And so I have an invitation to you to do better in our area, in medical devices. The second thing is to help show the types of things that, as foreigners, you can do by going into China. Most of you are not from China, and the people who are from China here today are all foreigners. So I think for this audience, knowing what your competitive strengths are when you're saying, we're going to do qual in China, is what I hope to share with you today. So as Cindy very eloquently talked about, China is a very interesting place to do research. It's one of the more complicated societies on the planet. It's also one of the biggest. Being closed, it's developed a tremendous amount of diversity. But just so you know a little bit more about who's talking to you. Medical devices. Medtronic is a global medical device manufacturer famous for the pacemaker, a leader in stents, and about 13,975 other things. So primarily we sell to physicians, but we also sell diabetes pumps, pumps that will be essentially an artificial pancreas if you have diabetes. We're about 45,000 people, so a very small company. We also have global offices, but trying to serve the needs of Asian markets is really a challenge for our industry. We lag on consumers because it's not simply adding corn to pizza because people like corn, and it's not sort of understanding the constraints in sort of a non-technical way. You have a very complex physiology, social elements, and other things that impact what medical device can do for our customers. So hopefully, maybe you can direct your eyes to this one since it seems a bit more on center. We go into operating rooms and we're often the first non-physicians ever allowed into this operating setting. And so we're trying to understand what's really different. It may look superficially similar, but in fact is quite different. This is an example of one of our products being used in open heart surgery to stabilize the heart so that they can have a shorter hospital stay and not have to use blood bypass. It allows the heart to continue beating while they're doing surgery. So this is an example of just the type of things that I spend a lot of time doing. I do both patient ethnography, talking to dealers, talking to hospital managers. So I spend a lot of time in very unusual situations. Sometimes people will only talk to me in the middle of the night off-site. And when I ask them the question about how does your department work, their hands are shaking. So this means that I'm in a very different environment than I've done research in other global markets. And people are reasonably cautious. So what does this mean for qualitative researchers? It means that China is different, but as a foreigner you can get some advantages. The first thing to understand about China is that the bell curve is larger in China than in any other country that I've worked in. Even in places like India, where you have lots of different distributions that are very unique, tremendously diverse culture, China, even though ethnically there's a very dominant culture, people are very, very diverse in terms of understanding of reality, economics, and even basic thought patterns that are uninterrupted in some cases for really almost 1,000 years. So you have such a different way of thinking that it really becomes the sweet spot for qualitative researchers. I've had a great conversation with a colleague here who we were talking about, what are qualitative people like versus what are quantitative people like. Quantitative people have some sort of commonalities with accountants. You want to manage risk, and you want to understand with high confidence what the correct answer is. Whereas qualitative people tend to be a bit more on the philosophical side, trying to understand the behaviors of people, find that human truth, and suffer a bit in the process of trying to find that insight that will allow you to live better. So the conclusion of that short conversation that we'll divert before jumping into the content today was that perhaps you can say Confucius was the first qualitative researcher. In fact, that he was rather describing human behavior with his writings rather than actually prescribing it. And I think in China you do see a lot of Confucius's work manifested, but I think he might be someone who's just able to describe well what people do. So why qualitative in China? Why are you right in the sweet spot of value for this very complicated market? Quantitative has some serious problems. I think a lot of you know about this a little bit. but it would be pretty hilarious if you had a camera taking a picture of who's filling out these surveys. It's their IEs, their helpers, sometimes people that they don't even know. You have more professional respondents in China because the pay from multinational company-sponsored studies is extremely high. It's really quite a bit of garbage. And when I used to execute global studies, always, you just end up scratching your head about what is China thinking. And the thing is, part of it is that it hides a massive distribution of very distinct ways of thinking. It's a very lumpy, it's not normal distribution in sort of the kind of cosmic order of things worldview. You have all these pockets of different behavior, rapidly changing. And so if you just are getting an average, or even you're looking at sort of a numerical distribution, it's impossible to decipher. So this is really where you come into your power as qualitative researchers. And so that's part of my argument to you and my invitation, that China is worth going to, worth developing competency in, because it's high value to customers, especially ones like us that have a higher bar for understanding. Scales have regional and translational issues. You know, if you say something is all right, is that the same as 还可以? Not really. It's pretty good. You have all these different confounding factors when you're trying to deal with languages that have such different structures of thought. And so you're trying to put this into a bucket that fits next to even qualitative buckets from other countries, and you end up with just struggling to draw that theme, struggling to find that really meaningful generalization. But there are things that you can do. And finally, it's probably obvious to you, but I'll explain a bit more. China is an insider country. It doesn't mean that everyone is an insider or it's centered around one thing, but there are many focal points of China. You have power, society, people, life is all these overlapping circles. And so, as a result, as an outsider, you are excluded from many of these things. But as an outsider, you also have access to things that none of the people in the country have. And I think Cindy got an opportunity to see this and was very eloquent about how there was an advantage to not being in the same social context. So why qualitative for me? In China, even when you do qualitative, you say, what should be done? And you get a philosopher's answer, the idea of what might beautifully happen in an ideal world. And if you say, oh, do you want cheap? No, I want expensive. I want the best. What do you do? Well, maybe there are some shortcuts sometimes, but it's not nice to talk about. And I think this is a very reasonable thing to say. It doesn't mean I'm not telling you the truth. I am telling you the truth. I know what's right. But life is complicated, and so I will adapt. As qualitative people, I think, hopefully this is where you get excited and you say, wow, that sounds like a really meaty challenge to try and decipher the way that people are thinking, the way that they're changing. One of the reasons why I feel like an invitation is necessary is because getting effective work and insight for medical devices is perhaps more complicated than for other industries. If you can't respond intelligently in a conversation to what is a beta blocker, you may not know how to understand what's going on for a heart failure patient other than they feel bad. You know, it's something where you have a lot of layers. You have to understand clinical science, technology around that, a bit about the market, and then you get to do the meaty context work so you can see how it all fits together. But I'm sure all of you are thinking, wow, that sounds like a lot of time and effort to do for one industry. But I hope I can encourage you to say, there's a real human benefit that hopefully will excite you by getting medical technology to be more appropriate for one of the world's largest populations. And so I'll give you a few examples that I think will connect to your daily life. But first to explain a little bit more about why being an outsider puts you in a strange position. So the cultural disposition to start from mistrust, I think is familiar in Asia, but less so in other places. You have a lot of history that shows you it's better off if you don't really kind of put it all out there at the beginning because, hey, you don't know. And so I think if you look at it, contrasting perhaps with my homeland of the US, you start saying, hey, I don't know this guy. Give him a chance, see how it goes. If he tries to do something bad or he seems a little bit shady, then I'll sort of withdraw. But you start out like this, whereas it starts the other way in China. And so it takes real trust building, evidence, and really focusing on this idea of what is trust in a cultural framework, to be able to even get access to the kind of qualitative information that a European would offer you in a casual conversation over a cup of coffee. It's a high complexity environment. What does that mean? It sounds pretty nebulous. It means that there's ambient risk. Being visible is a risk if it's not appropriate for you. If you suddenly show up in the news, that may mean that your life and the life of your family is over. So when the newspaper reporter shows up, if they don't have some hair stand up on the back of their neck, they don't have a very good survival instinct. And it sounds funny, but it's true. It's really an environment where you really, people behave reasonably based on what they're aware of. And I think that's a very fundamental human behavior. So if you're seeing people shaking hands in the middle of the night, this is a great cue to not dig through them, but to say, hey, can I find this in a way that would not threaten this person? It goes back to sort of the ethical question. People don't do a lot of qual in China. They don't know market research for the most part outside of larger cities, and qual is sort of this weird thing. Seems invasive, seems like, whoa, geez, this is very uncomfortable. Why are you asking me about this? What are you going to do to me? Are you trying to sell me something? There's no baseline for understanding what is market research, what is strategy, what is a product development process. And so knowing that there's no context will hopefully build a little bit of empathy with you as you seek to engage people from a very different context. And even though I'm saying this is different because it's China, I think it's easy to look back home and see some similar things that you can learn. It may be a matter of degree, but I think we are common, it's just different in certain ways. And there's sort of the insider society. It's all about relationship. And so this goes back to the fundamental question of bias for qualitative research. You can't find anything out without a relationship in China. So don't start saying, oh, we need an objective perspective about what is happening in China. All you can do is find the people who know. Triangulate from a bunch of different directions. Acknowledge the uncertainty of what you're looking at. And focus on doing rather than ultra-analysis. So I think these are very different approaches than a lot of the conservative global leading companies are used to. But I think the people who have a high enough priority on China are getting used to the uncertainty that exists in the marketplace, the focus on insight rather than validity, and the priority on action rather than hyper-analysis because of the complexity of the market that exists. So there are many circles in China, and there's actually a joy to this. Kids will make up new slang. They'll make new characters. They like having inside jokes, and China has circles that are created by this commonality of enjoying closeness by excluding others. And if you even look at the progression of language in China, you have this evidence from a long time ago to show that really the point of the language is not just to communicate, it's to identify who's in and who's not. It went from very simple, like pictograms like of a fish, to something that maybe looks like a box with a little loopy. So the point is that family relations, secondary relations in Chinese society are huge drop-offs in terms of trust, in terms of willingness to relate. And foreigners are sort of like space aliens operating in this environment, both to their advantage and to their detriment. You all look the same to me is something I've been told many times about foreigners in China. It's just because we don't speak the language of facial cues. So I think this is very similar the other way, but it's hopefully as quality as you guys are engaged in this struggle to understand something that's quite different. So I won't belabor this a bit because we're getting a bit deep, a little bit early in the session. But in the medical area, you have a couple things going for you as a foreigner. One is that you're less concerning. You may be a foreign visitor, and so this has a precedent as dignitary visits. You have the face of saying this person is important by bringing foreign people in to talk to them. The uncertain social status means, hey, this might be good. I'm not going to mess up my relationship with my friend by talking to this person because they're a space alien and they don't really exist in my social world. The journalism risk safety issue is a very real one. And so you have to understand that you need to explain why you're there and give people confidence that they are safe based on what they're doing and that they have appropriate safety from the vertical as well as from the lateral threats that exist in Chinese life. And sometimes, and I run into this periodically among a certain age group, there are old feelings that were developed in different times about having foreigners in China, about having different economic progress, about different ideas that will leave you in situations that require a high level of intercom. That may range from somebody deciding to call the police, to having a guard remove you from an area when you have arranged a meeting with them 3 months in advance. But I think if you expect this, and you understand the context, it becomes just an acceptable reality rather than something that is surprising and crazy. So China is a diverse place, and there's no more complexity or intensity than in a Chinese hospital. You have a few places where you can get care. Everyone packs in, you rush for a line, you either pay somebody to get a ticket and wait in line, and then you're waiting for hours. So you have a very, very chaotic environment that you have to navigate as a relatively low information person. You have to understand what is real, what is fake, what is real, what is fake. And this is kind of life in China, that you don't have trust in many things. And so operating in the medical space is one of these human situations. Who is the expert? What is the incentive for them to do something to me that will change my health? In a positive way and a negative way. As you might imagine, as a foreigner in China, sometimes the intensity saturates. There's just so much going on. You love it, but because it's so rich. But at the same time, if you don't have a high pain tolerance, it becomes like white noise. And I've seen many, many of my friends just bring it back down to the little point of light and say, okay, I'm going there, I'm going to walk there, I'm going to put my headphones in, and I'm going to go to work. And then I'm going to come back from work, and I'm not going to pay attention to anything. And this is reasonable, it hurts. But if you are interested, and hopefully as qualitative researchers, you thrive on the weirdest stuff, the most interesting stuff, because that shows you the human truth that drives you towards the philosopher's side. So how do you focus and drive a large company to take action? I think this is a really interesting thing. And so I'll be quick. Look at what's different. Difference is your advantage. You know what's different. It's invisible to the people who live in China, and so this is your competitive edge. Even something as simple as sitting, and so you have some people sitting in Times Square. It's a popular movie that came out maybe a year ago. The Chinese model of sitting is a very common everyday activity, but it has implications for medical devices. You know, if you look at an artificial knee articulates to about a little less than 90-degree bend, but that's not really going to do that well if you squat sit. Maybe if you did that once in a while, I could tolerate it, but you're talking about a device that doesn't work as well for you. If you look at our insulin pump and sensor, they help deliver insulin when your blood sugar is too high. It's a great technology, automatically closed loop. Says your sugar is too high, more insulin for you, you don't have to worry or know. But if every time you sit down, you're in pain and it pulls out the needle, it's not an effective solution. And as you've noticed at the top here, you can see that sitting is an everyday activity when going to the bathroom. So if you give somebody a set of knees that don't fully articulate, you've taken a big piece of life and made it very difficult for them. So there's real value to be gained by thinking about what are the things that I see as different, what are the needs that are implied by what's different, and how can we address that in a more meaningful solution. And I hope that this is an interesting anecdote for you. But the human side of this as well is that there's social value. People sit together with squat sit. So if you say, hey, I can only sit in a chair and everyone else is squat sitting, you lose that connection, the social sitting. And this is a big way that people spend time. And so you can really see a lot of different angles from even the most basic of daily activities. That you have a lot of value that can be yielded by understanding and designing. And that's why I titled this Design Research. And I'm hoping to bring some of you closer to what a customer in a company is looking for. We want to be able to do something that has economic value that people will say, I need that. So that we can exchange the money that they work hard for the things that we can provide them. A few more examples. I'll talk about this with you afterwards if you'd like to find out more detail about many, many critical insights. And I'll highlight one. The Restore Sensor neurostimulator for chronic pain. When people have chronic pain that keeps them in bed. Maybe they've crushed a nerve in their spine, maybe they have another accident that left them in trouble. We have an opportunity to help them be functional again by putting in essentially a pacemaker that will override the pain signal to allow them to be functional. So you have this solution, but then when they change position, the lead will move next to their spine and suddenly they're in tractable pain. It's not a workable solution, but just by watching people, the qualitative research, and talking to them about how things work, we can put a position sensor in there, solve a huge problem, and there's great benefit for a company like us to say, hey, people move. It's a simple insight, but if you look at these things, you can really have a big impact on quality of life for a lot of people, and that's really what the mission of Medtronic is about. So I'm at the end here, so I'll be close to on time. I'd say there are a few things for the tactical audience. If you're looking to get started in China, I'd say partner with ground level recruiters. The channel of introduction matters. If you're working with a company that's very famous in an area, this will get you much better information if it's not blinded. This is different than other markets where they'll say, oh, it needs to be valid, it needs to be blinded. But market research companies, when they go into China and they say, hey, I'm a market research company, they're like, holy crap, this is scary. It's not a good idea. So think about, how do you get the channel of introduction? How do you give people confidence that they're safe with you? If you start at the top, this is a key thing. If you find an organization, get permission if you can from the top of their organization, so they're not a rogue element that is going to be trimmed off by the next process of maintaining harmony. So also translation is a key issue that sinks a lot of people. If you're going to go to China, please do good translation testing. It's a big issue, and don't just send it to one of these generic translation companies because they are using Google Translate and they are terrible. Directness will often harm your inquiry if the topic is sensitive. So go be indirect. Ask about, don't say like, how do you feel being close to death? Just the human element, sometimes people forget when they're doing inquiries for a specific product segment that's sensitive. So if you look at what people enjoy and what they look forward to and their aspirations, as well as what do they feel like has been most successful, keeping things on a positive note will help maintain the quality of life of your respondent and leave your impact on their life as positive as possible. Abstractness is not a cultural norm, especially Western models. The ratings of value and all these typical concept testing things are totally not understood or accepted. So looking at analogy, going indirect, are key ways to understand and tap this critical market. And so with that, so this is an example of just an approach that you can think, a philosophy. This translates to, the water will slowly wear away the stone. So don't expect to go directly to the approach that you need and to drive towards that insight directly and say, I want it, I take it, it's mine. If you develop the relationship and you are able to get the empathy with the risks and the understanding of how China works at the superficial level so you can get one circle in, as a foreigner you have an advantage. And so that's the title of my presentation, is Great Qual, Great Reward. I think there's really a great opportunity. So thanks for that. And
Blumenthal, the Chinese company, are they all market research? Is a premium concept to them, right? Qualitative research for the Chinese companies.
So you were asking that our Chinese companies are open to qualitative research?
Yeah, not MNCs, I'm talking about
Yeah,
the
domestic.
Chinese companies. Do you know if they are open to such research?
Yeah, so some of the leading ones are, and as you'll see very different groups of Chinese companies. You'll have companies who are just making it work, making the tubing, process, cut costs, even unethically. And then you have other companies that have a competitive advantage that they've worked out and they're competing domestically, and then you have people who are competing on a global scale. The latter two are open to qualitative research, but they don't understand it. And so it requires a really clear ability to translate their activities that they can do to the things that you can tell them. And so the closer to what they do now that you can describe your value, the more successful you'll be.
I really like your perspective of being sort of within the context, within the cosmic context, and yet being a total outsider. I think we've all been there. Can you give some concrete examples of when you've actually benefited from being an outsider? You said that it does have its upsides too.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are lots of things that will seem high risk to tell to another Chinese person. that because you're like, well, this weird guy's here and he seems kind of nice and why not? People will tell me that, oh yeah, we buy a fake product to use for blood purification and it costs about half as much and, we try it out and if they get sick, we don't use it. If they don't seem to have any problems, we use it until they get sick and then we use an imported one. And I'm like, okay, seems pretty authentic. You have to use your analysis. But I think when you're doing things that are complex culturally and socially, because you sort of come out from left field, it's much easier to think about it in a way that doesn't seem threatening. Because my questions are sort of unloaded, if you like. I'm just curious, I don't know how it works. And so sometimes just say, oh, I don't know, I never thought about it. Usually most of them will never have thought about it in any analytical way. So this is sort of an opportunity for them to be introspective in a way that's not too uncomfortable and seems low risk because there's just this weird guy here who I can't recognize if I see him again 5 minutes later.
You spoke a lot about building trust with doctors or your respondents, making sure they don't feel threatened in any way when you're interacting with them. I guess in the last 6 months with the compliance issues in China, that's gone to a whole new level. So can you tell us a little bit about the challenges you're facing now building trust in the new environment in China?
Yeah, I think being reasonable and knowing that people behave in a way for a certain reason. So what was referred to, you have a GSK scandal where GSK had an extensive bribery situation exposed, tons of people put in jail, lots of real harsh punishments pending, and this is sort of what you call sort of the China signal. They're like, we are doing something different. And so when you see, they also, to use a more Chinese idiom, it's killing the chickens to scare the monkey. And so everyone's like, holy crap, am I next? What can I do that's okay, what can't I do? So you just need to work with people who have more natural exposure, the key opinion leaders, the people who are safe naturally because of their position in the power structure, and leave the people who are marginalized or maybe not in strong positions to decide what they're going to do on their own. So I think letting it pass, and there's usually about a 3 to 6 month window in which you can then tell about what the next action is going to be. Will it get better or will it get worse?
We've done groups with Chinese people in Australia, and if you're talking about something abstract, they don't understand, like politics, really hard to get them to talk, but things like credit cards and things closer to them, they're actually fine. It's hard to shut them up sometimes. And but I'm wondering how much of the difficulties that you talk about, the lack of trust and so forth, do you think is innate to the culture, and how much do you think it's just because of the communists and the often quite repressive background? Because I've got a Russian friend, and she's always telling me that it's not that we're always that bad, it's because we went through the Soviet Union and people just learn not to trust anything.
I think it's definitely a combination. One thing is just large scale. China has large scale since before, modern economic theory. People have been competing for thousands of years in a way that's very kind of one solution, everyone makes it through the door, and so this type of competition makes you less inclined to trust. There definitely has been an impact of the social instability and the dramatic changes, but it's a combination. I think there's a core of just saying, hey, if I don't know, maybe I should be careful. And that's a very central thing, which is a sharp contrast to the US.